In this lesson, we will learn about two-dimensional arrays, but we'll begin by reviewing the basics of arrays. We'll start with a new Java project, which we will call Array2D Intro. Click Finish to create the project, open the project, and within the source folder, create a new class called also Array2D with a public static void main method. And before the code begins, please take a moment to put your name in a comment along with the class and the date. We'll delete the unneeded comments, and then we'll begin by reviewing the process of declaring a new array. So, if we're creating an array of integers, we begin with the type, which is an int array. We can read the brackets as being array, followed by the name of the variable, which we'll call array, followed by the new keyword, and then int and how many elements are in our array. But that doesn't actually put any values in our array. So our next step is to write a loop that loops through each possible value in the array. And if you'll recall, to find out how many values there are, or how many elements there are in the array, you say r.length. So as long as I is less than r.length, we iterate to the next value. Then we assign r of I a value, and we'll go with something simple, I plus 1. Now, we also found that we quite often wanted to output the values of our array in a user-friendly way. So a method made it easy to do that over and over again. So we'll call it output, and then we simply passed the integer array to our method, where we repeated our same loop of iterating over each value, but this time, instead of assigning a value, we did a system out where we first outputted a bracket, followed by the index of the element, an equal sign, and then the actual array value. And this made it very easy for us to put a label of what we were printing, followed by the outputting the contents of the array. And that made for a very short, simple program that would just spit out array values. But it also then made it easy for us to write some simple code to modify the array. So this time we'll take the array value and we'll make it equal to its current value times, well, let's square it. And then we could repeat the process of outputting it with just 2 lines of code, changing this to after, and we had the basics of creating an array, outputting its values, modifying its values, and then outputting it again. Okay? The fundamentals of an array. So, now it's time to introduce our second dimension. And before we do that, we're going to go through this program and we're going to swap a few variable names to make it a little bit more readable once we introduce our second dimension. So the first thing to understand is that by convention, since our values are going down here, we consider these to be rows. So everywhere where I have I, I'm going to rename that variable using Eclipse's refactoring facilities and change the variable name to row. Now, that only does it in the main method. I also want to do the same thing in my output method. So I'm going to change that to row. And the goal here is just to make the code a little bit more readable. I is a very nice shorthand. It's very commonly used in programs, but it doesn't mean anything. So, how do we go about adding a second dimension? Well, just like before, we have our type. We begin with our type. So, whereas before we had an int array, now what we have is an int array with 2 dimensions. And this is the first time where the naming structure and vocabulary get a little confusing, because what we're actually saying is that we have an int array of arrays, which can also be read as a 2-dimensional array. And then we have the variable name equals the new operator, our variable type, how many rows we have. The first element, by convention, is considered the rows, followed by how many columns we're going to have. So let's start with 3 columns. This can now be thought of as not just an array, but as a matrix, because we have 5 rows with 3 columns. Now we need to modify our code to take into account the fact that we have an extra dimension. If we simply want to get our code working the way it did before, we can very easily go through and simply tell it that we always want to use the first column, which is column 0. And just as we did there, we have to do down here. And we can continue. But now our output method needs to be modified because it needs to have the same number of dimensions. And here we are outputting row and column 0. So if we run our program, it now looks exactly the same, except that we have the potential to have 2 more columns that we haven't used. So how do we begin to use those columns? Let's start with the process of filling the columns. Here we are iterating over the values of row. We want to do the same thing, but for each row, we want to look at each column within the row. So we add another for loop where we say our column index is going to be 0, and our column is going to continue to go up until we hit the number of columns we have. And this is where the first real point of confusion usually enters the picture. Because how do I figure out how many columns I have? When I said r.length here, I got back the number 5. How do I get back the number 3? Well, if you recall, when I was describing what was happening here, I actually said we had an integer array of arrays. And that is, in fact, what we have. We have an integer array of 5 arrays, each of which holds an array that has 3 elements. So if I want to know how many elements are in that array, I would say r of 0 dot length, and then I can iterate my column variable and put my curly braces in there. Now, I've glossed over quite a bit with that explanation, so let's go back and look at it. How many elements are in row 0? Well, all my rows have the same number of elements. So if I ask how many elements are in row 0, the answer is 3. If I were to ask how many elements were in row 1, the answer would be the same. I could also be more specific and say how many elements were in array of row. But the answer would always be the same because my array is a rectangular matrix. And so a shortcut is to simply use array of 0. Okay, now I'm assigning the same value of row plus 1. But what if I want to make this math a little bit more complex? Also, I need to change my element here to take into account my row and my column. So now I'm going to have my row plus 1 times my column. Okay? And then down here, in my loop down here, we'll just leave that one alone. We're only going to process the first column for now, but we do need to go into our output method because we want to output all of our columns. So we're going to once again write for int col equals 0, column is less than r of 0 dot length. Col plus plus, and then add my new curly brace, and I've now used my nested loop. I need to add my column here, and I need to make my printing here a little bit more complex, because now I'm going to have several columns going across. So I want this portion of my print here to actually come only once for each row. Let's see, I need a quotes there. So at the beginning of each row, I'm going to print row, the row number, followed by nothing. So I get rid of the print line. And if I want to put in some spacing so that I have a gap after that, what I can use is a Java escape character, which is the backslash character, followed by a T. What that does is that prints the invisible character of tab, or prints a tab into my string, so that I will get a space after this print. Then, here, I also want to print, instead of a print line, and I now only want to print my actual array value, followed by also a tab. What this will do is print my values going across. But when I get to the end of my line, notice I don't have a print line anywhere in here. So there's nothing that takes it down to the next line. So after it finishes printing a column, then I need to put a print line in. What do I need to print? Nothing. So I leave the parentheses empty. Okay, and now my program should be ready to run. So let's look at our results. And I'm going to try to adjust the window size here to give me enough room to see the important parts of my code. So let's start with our initial assignments here. I am going through each row and each column and assigning the value of row plus 1. So for the first row, they all get the value of 1 times the column number. Well, what is the column number? It's 0 for the first column. So first we do 1 times column, which is 0. Then we add row, which is 0, which gives us the value of 0. Then we go to the next column. So column is now 1 and row is 0. So what is 1 times 1? 1 plus 0 gives me the value 1. Then column becomes 2 times 1 plus 0 gives me the value 2. When I go down to row 1, I have 1 times 0 is 0, plus my row is now 1, so 1. And you can see that that will fill in these values. Then I go down to my print loop, which will print these out, and we get the row number here. Notice we don't have anything printing our columns here. So how would we make it so we could print our columns going across? Well, this one gets a little bit more complex, but it is doable. So what we would have to do is, before we started printing our table, we would have to make a separate for loop that goes through our columns just like before, r of 0 length, and we're going to print out each column number with our square brackets. Before we do that, if we run our program again, take a second to look at it, since our row labels are here, the first thing we need to do is skip some space. So before we even start, we do a system.out and print line, and simply print a tab character. Then, for each of our columns, we do a print of our square brackets, followed by our column index, followed by another closed square bracket, and then our tab character. And it looks like I must have messed something up here. Oh, I forgot my out. Okay. Then, when I'm done, I need to go down to the next line. Okay. So if I run this again, it looks like it worked almost. I didn't get my columns lined up here correctly. So let's see, what do I need to do? I probably need to put a space in there so it skips a little bit of space. Nope. Let's see. Oh, I made it a print line. It should have been a print. There we go. Okay. That should take care of it. There we go. So now our columns are labeled. Our rows are labeled. So I can look and see that this is row 0, column 0. This is row 4, column 1. And that takes care of all of our processes necessary to work with two-dimensional arrays. At this point, you should be ready to go on to the PDF about two-dimensional arrays, read through and follow along with that sample program, and complete the assignments associated with it. The only thing that hasn't been covered in that document that we didn't do here, or that is covered in that document that we didn't cover here, is that it works with string arrays, but they are fundamentally the same, so it should not be too difficult to adapt.